Hi, I'm Ashok Gangadine, founder director of the Global Dialogue Institute. And I wanted to welcome you to our new site. It's been dormant in many ways, but now we're starting it up in a new way with a whole new orientation. And I really wanted to introduce you to it and say a little about my own journey as a philosopher and a philosopher of dialogue and crossing worlds and bringing worlds together and global wisdom over the past 50 years. I'm in my 47th year, just concluded my 47th year of teaching in the philosophy at Haverford College, and that's where we are now. And the Global Dialogue Institute, one of the home bases, is here at the college where it was founded. And it was started to emerge in the mid-90s, so it's been 20 years. We're now in 2015, in the spring of 2015, just to locate where we are. So the Global Dialogue Institute has been really in flight for the past 20 years. And I think it might be helpful as you visit the site to share some very exciting possibilities about global dialogue and what it means. What is global and what is dialogue? Because we might misunderstand when we are really in deep dialogue, real dialogue, crossing different worlds. And it really is perhaps one of the most foremost issues facing humanity today in a long millennial journey through the centuries. We know that many worlds are clashing. We know that it's very challenging to cross different worlds, worldviews, different ideological structures. So for example, if you're in the Judeo-Christian world, which is already highly complex in terms of the lens of the mind and how we see reality, can we enter the Buddha mind? That's a very different space, a different mental ecology. Can we enter the world of Lord Krishna and the Gita and the Vedantic philosophy and wisdom? Can we enter into the Zen mind? Can we cross into the Greek logos? The word logos is profound in the Greek philosophy. First philosophy of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and the whole evolution of the European journey into the depth of human reason, seeking to try and understand the ultimate structures of human reason and what it means to be human. So really, this is very much at the heart of global dialogue. And just to give you a sense of myself and introduce on a more personal note, I'm completing my 47th year as a philosopher. I'm the Margaret Guest GEST Professor of Global Philosophy at Haverford College. I've been teaching courses in first philosophy. I'll say what that's about in a moment. Ontology is my background, which is the grammar of realities and how they're formed and crossing worlds and making transitions. Communication and translations and interactions across worldviews is part of my work in deep ontology. I'm also coming out of the background of logic, which is a classical, profound science seeking to understand the structure of thought, the logic of reason, the grammar of thought, which is in between logic and ontology, which are two of my background journeys over the past 50 years. I've been really focused on one of the most fundamental issues facing humanity. How do we cross different worldviews? Do we understand the depth of differences across worlds? Because if you're in one worldview and what makes sense to you and your cultural perspective, it shapes the lens of our mind, so to speak. We usually don't use that metaphor of a lens, but what we see when we're in a world, a worldview, an orientation to reality, affects everything as how we interpret ourselves, our others, our experience, and other cultures from our lens. And what we find, what I found as a philosopher over these past 50 years, focused on the question, can we cross worlds, really? They're so profoundly diverse. Because what makes sense in, say, the Christian world may not make sense in the Buddha mind. It may not make sense in the yoga space. It may not make sense in the logos of Socrates and Plato, if we go there, or Lao Tzu, or Confucius in the Chinese mind, or entering into African modes of thought, or feminist modes of thought, or scientific perspective. These are profoundly different ways of processing reality. And it brings a different lens. So for example, if you're in astrophysics and cosmology and physics and you're trying to understand the evolution of the universe and the Big Bang as a way of making sense of what's going on in reality, and you also coming out of Genesis and the biblical and the Genesis understanding of God created the world, let there be light. Genesis is a very different narrative and it involves a different lens to be in the biblical world where spirit, infinite spirit, Yahweh, creates reality and speaks it forth as a source of reality. So Genesis and Big Bang are profoundly different. How do we understand across worlds was a question when I arrived in Haverford College in 1968 as a young philosopher. I'm still young, I think. Trying to understand the logic and ontology of different worlds and asking a profound question, can we really cross worlds? Can there be dialogue across worlds? So over the many decades of work, I was also very fortunate because we're right now in the Margaret Guest Center at Haverford College, the Margaret Guest GEST Center for the cross-cultural study of religions and worlds and scriptures and traditions, and to understand how do we appreciate the depth of diversity across worlds, to truly see that and honor it and not try to water it down, but also to explore the possibility of common ground and possible unity in that diversity. That is really the vision of Margaret Guest, and I've been playing a role in the Margaret Guest Center for years as a director of the center, trying to launch it in a creative way. And so it's been, in a wonderful way, a laboratory for me to bring practitioners of the great diverse religions and cultural perspectives and feminist thinkers and scientists and others. So whether we're bringing in someone from the Buddhist tradition or the Yoga Vedantic tradition or the Platonic Greek tradition, various mystical traditions, to really understand how does dialogue work? Can we really connect across borders? And what I began to see is very often what we think is dialogue is really a form of what I would call monologue. Because dialogue, if you're listening to the other from your lens, whatever your cultural lens or complex lenses may be, and you're seeing the other from a different world that makes sense of the world very differently and speaks a different language, a different mental ecology, we miss each other. Because if I'm seeing the other from my lens and privileging my lens, so to speak, and interpreting the other from my point of view, am I really hearing her voice, in her voice? And am I able to access the mental ecology of the other? It's a profound question between self and other, across borders and worlds and human relations. How do we listen to someone who's in a very different mental lens, different perspective, different worldview, a different ideology? This is at the heart of global dialogue. So I, after spending decades in the laboratory of the Margaret Guest dialogues, what began to emerge for me as a philosopher, and concerned with first philosophy. And first philosophy is a name that comes from Aristotle, and it's been a long tradition across the planet, is that the deepest minds have seen that there is something first. Whether we call it Yahweh, or Logos, or Tao, or Om, or the Buddha space of Shunyata, whatever name, God, what Christ, whatever name we use for what Allah, for what is first. It has a profound logic to it, a code of what is first. And our great teachers and scriptures have been trying to help us understand, how do we enter the Word of God? How do we enter yoga space? How do we enter the Om code? How do we enter the Buddha code? How do we enter the code of Logos and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle? These are profoundly different alternative ways, and logic attempts to get to the codes of these great first philosophies. But what we begin to see is that could these first philosophies, as profoundly diverse as they are and magnificent, can they be coming from a common ground, a common source? That's one of the great questions that I investigated. And over the decades, in the laboratory of dialogue, I began to see that what often passes for what we would call dialogue, because imagine around a table there's someone from the Buddhist tradition, someone from the Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, someone from a scientific perspective, a feminist perspective, someone from the rational logos perspective, for example, from the Chinese Qi energy, speaking, and they're speaking from their perspective, and they're missing each other. So that what I began to see over decades is that we need to call out what I would call deep dialogue. It's a term I introduced about 25 years ago when I saw that what we ordinarily call dialogue from an ordinary language point of view is often monologue. We see the other from our point of view, and we're not able to set back our lens and dilate our hearts and minds and open up the space for dialogos. Dialogue means dialogos, through the logos, and it means we have to go deeper, to really open up our minds and our lenses without giving up our position, but to step back and cut some slack so we can really listen to the other in her voice. That's one of the greatest challenges for being a human. And that we're dialogue beings. As I began to see what is the wisdom that's coming out of all of these great geniuses and scriptures through the ages and trying to get to what is first, which is profoundly named differently. I began to see that if you listen deeply, you will see that there's a science in the deepest level of trying to understand this infinite first. Because when you go more and more across borders, over the centuries, you see these great minds seeing that what is first is infinite. It can't be bound. So think about that for a moment. If it's infinite, it's not finite, it's transfinite. It means you can't bound it. You can't bind it. It's not bounded. It's boundless. And if it's boundless, it's limitless. And very quickly you begin to see you can't draw a boundary around what is profound and first. So what is first is infinite, transfinite. But if you follow the logic and the science of that, whether you're using Yahweh or Logos or Tao or Om or Buddha nature or the origin of the universe, whatever trail or name you're using, once you begin to see the infinite is on the ground floor, the logic is impeccable and powerful. It shows that what is infinite is infinitely one. You can't have two. Because if there were another infinite, it would limit the other, and that it would self-destruct. It would no longer be infinite. So there can't be another bounding it or limiting it. So it's got to be infinitely one. This has been seen all through the ages. But if you think it through, it means if it's infinitely one, then all of these worlds and forms of life and cultures and scriptures and first narratives and first philosophies must be coming out of a fundamental common source. And it doesn't mean you have to not call it Yahweh or not call it Allah or Om or Tao, but we have to realize that these names have global power. And what global means, and this is the point I'm getting to Global Dialogue Institute, global means all possible worlds. So I know we use the term global, typically in the culture at this point, to think of global corporations and global financing and global politics and for the planet as a globe. But in wisdom and first philosophy, first science, and I'm going to suggest that there's a source science, that all of these great traditions have been pioneering and tapping to get to the fundamental source that generates all our possible worlds. And when we are really coming out of this deep source, whatever name, we don't have a common name for it. So all of these amazing first names, which allege to get to the fundamental first infinite, must be converging and arising together from a common source. And any of those names that we use, and there are no limits to the first name, because once you see it's infinite, it has infinite names. And once you see it's infinitely one, it must be infinitely here now. This is one of the most powerful advances to recognize in the art of deep dialogue and global dialogue, that the infinite is infinitely here. You can't displace it. And all of our narratives, all of our cultures, all of the ways we're oriented, all of our disciplines, whatever language we're speaking, has got to be sourced and held by the source. That is just basic science. And that's global dialogue. Global dialogue means all possible worlds, all possible disciplines, all languages, all perspectives, all narratives must come from this fundamental first. And this has been seen. But to really realize it, we've got to see one of the most striking things that we gather from the journey into deep dialogue is that deep dialogue requires us to step back from whatever lens or lenses we have and privileging it and dilate it open, which we all have that capacity. That's the heart of human reason, to open up our lens for deeper encounter with the other and with the source. And that has been the long evolutionary journey that our great teachers and traditions and scriptures have been calling. To the extent that they're speaking from what is first, they're speaking from the source. And the source is going to be the source of all. And that infinite source of all is infinitely here now. Why? Because in the ego-mental way of thinking, when you make yourself an ego, a separate alleged being on your own, or your world, and you have it cut off from the source, if you de-source it, then in effect you're demoting the infinite to making it finite, because you're excluding yourself from it, or putting yourself outside of its space. That's impossible. And our geniuses have seen that. So what is first and sourcing is sourcing all possibilities. And so what I'm trying to suggest is once you get a feeling for the depth of between worlds and dialogue and dialogos, that I select the name Logos, Sophia, from the Greek, with this tradition of rationality and logic and science, not to promote it above the other names, but as a call-out name for Yahweh and Allah and Om and Tao and Buddha nature and the unified field of science, whatever name we use, are all connected in that space. And so the Logos Sophia is a source. And I include the Sophia because Sophia, I'm a philosopher, and Sophia is wisdom, the embodiment of wisdom. So Logos Sophia is rationality, word, speech, mind. All of these words come from the Logos. In the beginning is a Logos, and it's Logos Sophia. And so deep dialogue is the human art. Because what we begin to see across borders when we look at all of these great different worlds and traditions calling us to come to the source, to realize that we're source beings, we're source sapiens, we're logo sapiens, not ego sapiens. So I won't go on further with that. You'll see when you visit the site that all of the different presentations in our Global Dialogue Institute site, which has been cultivated over the past 20 years, of bringing deep dialogue to the culture in all levels of our culture. And so what I call deep dialogue, I introduce that name to help call out that real dialogue, deep dialogue, requires us to have the courage and the intelligence to step back from privileging our lens, whatever it is, naively, and to see the other and all the universe and all experience from our lens without questioning as a critical thinker. So deep dialogue is critical thinking, the possibility of being monitoring and critiquing, not giving up, but being willing to dilate and open more deeply. And if you're really in a fixed narrative, an ego-mental, a monocentric, then you're in monologue. And to enter the art of deep dialogue is to open up space to listen to the other. And we have that capacity. We're wired for that. That's human reason. So we're Logos sapiens. We're dialogue beings. And this is amazing to hear that, because what does it mean to be a dialogue being? It means I can't cut myself off from the other. We are all interconnected on the deepest level because we're source beings. And in the source, everything is connected. And that is really the art of being human. Because if we fall into monologue, it's pretty obvious. You look over the millennia. What do we see? The clash of worlds. And it's been abysmal. When worlds collide and worldviews are at war, cultural wars, mental ecologies are ideological wars, the Holocaust, the genocide, ethnic cleansing, the breakdown of human relations, all of these crusades and religious wars, it's a clash of worlds. And we must ask, why is that happening? For example, between Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all come as children of Abraham. If they're all connected in the biblical roots to the origins of Abraham, why is there war? Why cannot there be dialogue and understanding? The world is in shambles right now with a collision of terrorism and war and violence, and it's been going on for millennia. Why? Because we are not able to get to real dialogue. And that's really what the Global Dialogue Institute is all about. It's cultivating deep dialogue across worlds to respect diversity, but to understand that when you get to the source, the dialogos, that it's so powerful, the unity is so profound that it protects diversity. Because in the infinite field of unity, it's infinitely diverse. And this means all the diverse narratives and worldviews and religions and disciplines and orientations are to be respected. Every person is sacred in that source space as Logos sapiens. And that we have to mature from being an ego sapien in monologue to deep dialogue and to realize we are I-thou humans. To be a human, a person, is to realize we're connected and interconnected through the source with the other and with nature. Nature is sacred. The other is sacred, being open to other worlds in a non-violent way. So this really, understanding the art of deep dialogue is the art of being a human, and it's a key to our survival and sustainability and bringing non-violence to the awakened global culture. And that is the mission of Global Dialogue Institute. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Global Dialogue Institute. And as you surf the site, you'll see many different items. One of the things I'm pleased about is called the 7 Stages of Deep Dialogue. It's a meditation I had around 1997-98, which it's been shared around the world. It's showing what are the 7 classic stages of dilating our hearts and minds as a human, from ego-log to dialogue, from the ego-mental space, when you're not seeing the other, when you realize that, the other is an other. That's a start, that's stage 1. To realize the other that you've been seeing has a different world. And that sets a kind of crisis of having to say, can I enter the world of the other? That's stage one. Imagine 7 stages of going deeper and deeper until we find the common ground, which is in the source. So enjoy the website. It's a pleasure to have you join us. And going through the 7 stages, and there are many documents and YouTubes, and you'll see many different ways of seeing the art of deep dialogue. And over the past 20 years, we've been taking this dialogue out across the planet. We've helped the education department in Indonesia, trying to retool their educational structure from monologue to dialogue. We've had business leaders trying to understand how do we bring the culture of dialogue into the business world, educators and trying to understand education and liberal arts, and how do you bring the connections and interconnections across our disciplines for integral science, for peace and global citizenship, and to understand that all of these liberal arts are connected when you enter into the intelligence of dialogue. So at all levels, having diplomats at the UN understand crossing worlds, Congress, people in Congress understanding how to deal with difference so we're not polarized and broken and fragmented. And this is the key to really the heart and cultivation of real democracy. Real democracy flourishes in deep dialogue. Just giving you examples. So every part of parenting, raising children, teaching students, dealing with the other at all levels of culture, it requires us to stand and respect the other and be open to the other and realize we're deeply connected with the other. So welcome to the Global Dialogue Institute. I hope you enjoy it, and all the best.